Man, it's funny. Like the last few years, I think I've been down a bit of a productivity rabbit hole in terms of just the most efficient ways to manage time and how to get the most out of your day. And, it's not a new concept, especially here in Australia. I'm sure it's the same in the UK. But one thing that I've very, very rarely come across in all of the wonderful methods for managing your time is just a reminder that no matter how organized you are, eventually you're going to die and all your plans are going to come to a rapid halt. And I thought, so wild to me that it's come as a shock to be reminded of this very obvious news. But it seems that when you're trying to make any, practical steps towards where it is you're trying to achieve, the one thing that you've got to keep in mind is regardless of how organized you are, eventually you're not going to be able to get everything done. I thought it was an interesting direction to take with 4,000 weeks, a really obvious direction that no one had seemed to have written about. What was the sort of motivation to take that particular direction for your book?
I mean, I think you're totally right that it's not how people tend to think about productivity, but I really feel, and in many ways I only sort of realized this writing 4,000 weeks, but in many ways I think that it's not just that we don't think about our mortality and our finite nature when we are trying to make ourselves more productive. It's that we are trying to make ourselves more productive, at least on some level, so that we don't have to feel and think about our finite nature. So I'm not quite claiming that, the reason you download some amazing new productivity app is because you're afraid of mortality. That's probably a little bit sort of overly blunt. But I do think that, that whole feeling that we have that we have to be able to do more, that we need to be able to get to the point where we can, deal with every demand that's thrown at us or put into practice every ambition that occurs to us, really sort of feel on top of things. That is basically some kind of, it comes from a discomfort with what it really means to be finite, right? Which is not only that you'll die eventually, hopefully a long time from now, but also that on the level of an individual day, right, you just have to make choices all day long. You won't be able to do more than a fraction of all the things that it would be great to be able to do with a given day or a given hour. So we're just in this awful claustrophobic, kind of unpleasant situation all the time because we're finite and mortal. And like, how amazing it would be if there was a system or a book or an app that would find you the escape hatch from that. That would be wonderful. So I think it's incredibly obviously appealing. And obviously I write the book because I was, more than anyone I know, in that kind of mindset for many years of my life.
Yeah, claustrophobic's a good word for it. I mean, I've noticed that there's no real correlation between how much I get done in a day and how much at ease I feel about the rest of my life. In fact, sometimes I notice the faster I seem to run, the faster I seem to try and operate, the more I cram into a day. In fact, the very opposite's true. I'll come home and my wife's like, "Why are you so angry?" I'm like, you just wouldn't understand how productive I've been.
Yeah, right. There's no relationship between how productive you are in a day and your mood. There's also no relationship between how popular productivity techniques are and how productive the economy is as a whole, right? So like, none of this is really productivity. It's something else. It's some sort of emotional battle that we're sort of locked in, this desire to feel more in control of our lives than we are. And yeah, actually, if you just say like, what are the days in recent history when, certainly from my experience, when I've just sort of got the most done that was meaningful and that was absorbing and that I was proud of what I produced, you just sort of stumble into that. I do think you can set up your environment and your way of approaching time to make those days more likely, but you can't get there by following a very specific routine and scheduling your day in a specific way. That is just, it's too mysterious for that, I guess.
Yeah, it's wild to me as well. Like a lot of the time, I'm not sure if I'm a typical type A kind of personality, but perhaps I am. And that's probably my appeal towards books like the one you've just written. Like it's a constant reminder that I just, like the moment that I stop reading and learning about it, the more I realize, okay, like you really need to be reminded of this for the rest of your life. But I mean, I say that because there's certain personalities in so many different fields that really appeal to me, not just because of the quality of the work that they produce in their chosen industry, but the way they seem to hold themselves as they do it. Like Rick Rubin's one who comes to mind. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the music producer Rick Rubin. He's worked with so many, of the greats in the industry from so many different genres, and he, in everything he does, like, I'm not sure if he just portrays himself well, but he seems to have a foundation which has been developed, which allows him to go, okay, well, regardless of what it is I'm investing my time in, I'm going to invest it in a way that appears as though I know the outcome's going to be positive.
Right.
Like, I know a lot of the time for myself, I'll feel rushed or I'll feel hurried, and I'll do more things than perhaps I can handle, because I know that not every one of them is going to succeed. And sometimes you can fall prey to the illusion that you're like, all right, well, if I just chuck a little bit more at the wall, maybe one of them will stick, and then I'll get a little bit more clarity. But yeah, it is strange, like trying to find that balance between, or it's more of a perspective, isn't it? Like more of a mindset to say, okay, well, this is the thing that I've chosen to dedicate my time and attention to. There's no guarantee that it will work or it's going to be well received or that even I'll like it. But at least when you operate on that project with that attitude, it's maybe slightly enjoyable.
Yeah. And, I think that's a really good point. And I think a central part of that, although people don't always want to hear it, is to appreciate how low the stakes are, right? Because it's incredibly easy, just because of how we are constructed as humans, to assume that, almost without investigating the matter, right? You just, like, it's as if all history was leading up to my lifespan, and the things I do with my day are just tremendously important, and that it's life or death, and if I don't get things right and do the best job I can, it's going to be awful. Now, in certain contexts, there are ways in which we do need to do things, right? You need to keep a roof over your head, you need to meet the requirements of a job if you're working in a job, but on that existential level that says, if I don't do all this stuff really well and at a huge quantity, then on some level I kind of don't have any right to exist. This is a very prevalent view among the kind of people that get labeled insecure overachievers, to use the psychological term that lots and lots of people I talk to seem to resonate with. And it's this notion that, like, you'll be a terrible person if you don't, on some level, right? If you don't get to the end of the day and are able to say that you've really been incredibly productive. And when you just sort of turn all that down, when you see how irrelevant in the scheme of things it is whether you do a good job of something, if you see that it's just not important to your self-worth, right? You have the right to exist regardless of what you do, and also not that important, in the terms of, on a historic timescale of the Earth. I find that, and I think anyone can find that, if I can convey this properly, not depressing, not a recipe for nihilism, but actually incredibly energizing, because then it's like, oh, okay, I can just do this. I can just try this. I can just experiment with this thing. My, validity as a human being is not resting on how it goes. And I think an awful lot of procrastination is rooted in that sense of, like, if I get this wrong, it'll say something really bad about me to myself. And it won't, so you might as well do it. Is my general.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that realization can be something that leads to nihilism, and it can also be something that leads to a whole great deal of hope and weight off your shoulders, depending on the way you see it. Like, I wonder what it is, because I feel like I fluctuate between the two perspectives from time to time. One morning I'll wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, like everything's going to end one day, so you may as well just throw caution to the wind and see how well you can do it. And the other days I wake up and go, oh my gosh, I might only have, well, far out, I don't actually know how short a time I might have left, but it might be incredibly limited, so I better get up and do as much as I can. Or, yeah, I guess the downside of that is just do nothing at all, based on the fact that it, potentially all means nothing. But what do you think that is? Like, I know you've spoken to so many people. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of a philosopher whose work I really admire, called Ido Landau, who points out that, like, the idea that if what you're doing doesn't matter for the universe, therefore it's not worth doing, is actually a very kind of, it's actually a really idealistic and absolutist viewpoint. That nihilism that says, like, nothing I do today is going to matter in 1,000 years, so why am I even bothering? Or maybe that something you're doing will matter, but only as a microscopic drop in the ocean as part of a collective effort, right? The idea that means it's not worth doing actually depends on a definition of meaning that says things can only be valuable if they have that kind of reach through the centuries or across thousands of miles. And we all know from, everyone can point to some moments in their life when they knew that what they were doing with their time at that point was the right thing to be doing, and they felt deeply sort of in the right place. And sometimes that can be incredibly enjoyable when you're sort of, getting to know your newborn baby or something. It can also be deeply stressful, also babies, but it can be crises that are happening. It could be caring for a very sick older relative. It doesn't have to be fun, but there is that sense of like, oh, this matters, and it's good that I'm using this bit of my time for this purpose. But yeah, an analytical philosopher could always sort of say, yeah, but that's not going to matter to anybody in 1,000 years' time, or there are more important things you should be spending your time on. I think at the end of the day, you sort of have to say, so what?
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting. I'm not sure if I'm making this up. Are you friends, or have you had something to do with Rich Raw?
No, I haven't. I mean,
I
know
don't
who
know.
he is.
I don't know why. I don't
Yeah.
know why I thought you had. Rich Roy is a Franciscan priest that I'm a really big fan of. He's written some really interesting
Oh yeah,
works
no.
on.
Sorry, I slightly mistaken. Yeah, we're not friends. I haven't met him, but I've quoted him, and I know who you're talking about. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Okay.
There was a
Yeah, I
little
wasn't.
distance, internet connection, and accent problem there, but I'm on the case.
It's funny. I was bragging to my wife that the bloke that I'm about to speak to is good friends with Rich Raw, so I won't let her hear that part. But he's a guy that I really like on this subject for a variety of reasons. But like one thing that he says that I find really helpful, whether you're from any spiritual tradition or not, obviously he's from the Christian tradition. He talks about how one of his most helpful mottos to remind himself throughout the day when it comes to feeling stress around the work that he's doing is that he works as though it's up to God, but he prays as though it's up to him. And I guess like when you break that down, it's like, all right, well, being gifted a certain amount of talents. Ricky Gervais, the comedian, often says as well that when it comes to succeeding in comedy, you've got to work really hard and also get really lucky. And I guess maybe that's more of a secular way of putting that thought down in different words. And I like both of those perspectives because both are saying, okay, well, it's true that you can put in the work, but the outcome is not directly correlated to the amount of work or effort that you put in. Always, sure, some of it might be. But I think for myself, at least, I'll fall into the trap of going, no, like I've got to prove myself to the universe as to how much I deserve whatever it is I want to succeed at. And there's going to be, some reward directly correlated to how much time and effort I put into the project.
Yeah, right. No, exactly. I'm getting a message that my fancy microphone here is no longer being recognized, is no longer what Riverside is picking me up on. I'm sorry to interrupt the flow.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Should I? Yeah, go on.
I was going to say, if you like, I mean, I wonder, they do a backup recording. So I think at the very worst, it's going to get you. It probably just means you're coming through the computer audio, which might not be as crisp as it would otherwise be. But I mean,
yeah, that's the only problem. I think it just means that it's picking me up as normal and recording me, but it's doing it through the MacBook. If you don't mind about that, then
no,
then
I don't
carry
mind.
on.
I don't think there's going to be any wild difference in audio quality, especially post-production and stuff. So
all right,
yeah,
let's keep going.
I could see I got a little message as well that I could see is both trying to navigate the conversation just with the it's the blessing and the curse of this technology. Hey,
yeah. No, okay, cool. That's fine. It's fine with me, and I can still hear you loud and clear.
I can edit that part out, so that won't even air. Yeah, no, but just to refresh what I was finishing up on before, I was just saying that I think a lot of the time, I'll work with this attitude, and it's almost like a sacrifice to the gods of whatever project I'm working on, where I go, no, you really need to work hard and do more hours and do more time just to prove how much it is that you deserve it. But then I speak to people, and I mentioned Rick Rubin, he's one. There's a guy that I really like in Australia called James Schramko, who just his whole philosophy around work and business just really strikes a chord with me. He understands that, yeah, sure, work has a place in his life, but for him, his main priority is like his family, his health, contribution, and he's got real clarity on that. And the idea that I'm sort of getting at there is there's this illusion that I think a lot of us buy into, that we think we're going to be rewarded purely for the amount of time and effort, when sometimes it's the actual quality or the selection of the project which maybe matters more than how much time is invested in the actual work.
I think that's right. And actually, that it's reminding me of something that I write in my forthcoming book, not to get too self-promotional, but anyway, talk about that maybe. But the idea here is that actually we sort of chronically confuse effort with value. So we chronically think that if something is hard and exhausts us, that it must therefore have been good. If you collapse onto the couch at the end of a day, you know, feeling totally exhausted, it's very easy to feel virtuous, like, hey, I really, really, you know, did some work today. And of course it could have all been completely pointless busy work, at least in theory. And likewise, I think we assume that if something is meaningful to us, it must be going to be really, really difficult. And actually, contrary to a lot of kind of discipline heavy personal development advice that's around at the moment, one thing I really wanted to investigate in my writing was that for a certain kind of person, of whom I am one, and I think they're pretty common, and from some things you said, I think you might at least partly be one of them too, the really difficult thing is to allow the possibility that the work is going to be easy. The difficult thing is not that you're liable to spend all day in bed doing nothing and you're a lazy good for nothing. The danger is that you're so sort of caught, you've got your sense of what it means to be a sort of decent human being so tangled up with the idea of like exertion and doing things and shipping product, you know, that that to ask yourself, like, oh, like, what if I went into this particular challenge assuming that it was going to be easy, at least until I get any incoming data to suggest otherwise. And of course, it, you know, it's quite an unsettling thought, at least it is for me, but a large majority of the time it makes things easier and you do them better. And then a small minority of the time it doesn't make them any worse, because they were going to be difficult all along. So fair enough, and you deal with the difficulties. But I really think that willingness to allow yourself to not put effort in is where it's at to some extent.
Yeah, I remember I used to hear a story about Kobe Bryant when he first got drafted into the NBA, and he often heard about what made great NBA players. And one of the big things was naturally you had to have a certain level of talent, obviously. But then there was like an obsession with the work, and there was an obsession with hard work. And so many players would talk about, you want to be great, you got to do the hard work. And he was freaking out because he's like, oh, I don't know that I'm that driven. I don't know. Anyway, he got to basketball training on the first day, and he was there an hour before anyone. He was just shooting some basketballs, and you know, he got through training. And then after training, he's like, I'll shoot some more. And then he started having people going to him, yeah, you've got exactly what it is that is required to perform at this level. Like, you're just obsessive. And he's like, I'm just playing. This is this what you guys are talking of? Okay, I do have that. But you're right. Like, the idea that we're just speaking about it so often associated with this feeling of just like, oh, this is miserable and I don't want to do it. And yeah, if you're enjoying it, then obviously the results aren't going to be seen. It does seem to be like a fairly common, even, you know, even if it is a subconscious belief that a lot of us probably fall prey to.
No, totally. And it's really important in that context, if you are the kind of person who is sort of, firstly, the word driven is so interesting, right? Because like, this is something we do to cattle or cars, and yet it's a compliment to say to somebody that they're driven, that there's some force that almost they can't control that is pushing them to exert more and more and more. And yeah, I think that it's really worth checking in that if you do find large swathes of your work unpleasant, firstly, what happens if you allow it to be easy? And secondly, if it isn't easy and isn't going to be easy, at least make sure it's some place you want to get, right? I mean, I think a lot of people just like move forward in this driven mindset and then get to achieve something, and then immediately the fact that it's been achieved means that it doesn't really count and you've got to go for the next one. And, you know, I'm just talking about myself at university and in the first few years of my adult career here, really. It's no way to live. and I do think a lot of the conversation about discipline in terms of personal productivity misses that focus on, like, ultimately it's got to be valuable to feel, you've got to feel alive, otherwise why are you doing any of it?
For sure. As a yoga teacher I like, he often says, stop trying so hard, start trying so easy. And I go, there's something in me whenever he says it, I do feel my muscles relax a little bit, because I just get caught up in that game of like, oh, no, but I really want to touch my toes or whatever it is that I'm doing.
Yeah.
I mean, the creative process is an interesting one as well. And I know I'm from the stand-up comedy world here in Australia. And I mean, there's some crossover between the work that you do and the work that I do in terms of, there's some structures that are required when it comes to meeting deadlines or when it comes to creating content. But there's also that creative element that it's always interesting just to see how those two blend together. Like, some of the most creatives are some of the least structured, and some of the most structured seem to be some of the least creative. Like, what's your own process for writing? Because that's one that I often, I notice with the way that I write comedy, it often seems to change between, just speaking into my microphone on my phone about ideas, or just recording a note or taking notes on something from conversation, but then going, all right, no, I really need to sit down for, half an hour or an hour and actually do some structured writing. And I mean, this is one area that I can often fall into a real, like a real structure. It has to be this process. But on the, to continue what you were saying before, there's no correlation, I don't think, between my best ideas and the allocated structured time to write.
No, it's really interesting. I've, if anything, become a lot looser I've become less structured as I've gone on as a writer. I certainly had this experience writing this new book where 4,000 Weeks had done quite a lot better than I expected, and so I had this very predictable response where you sort of freeze, because you feel like you've got to do as well as that, or that if you mess it up, there'll be more people watching than before, so it'll be more humiliating or something. So I got into the usual writer's psychodrama tangle about all of that. And the way through that for me was to sort of become even more willing than I'd managed to be before then, to be sort of loose and unstructured and to do free writing. These are kind of exercises I would have scoffed at even just like 5-10 years ago, probably, where you just write, set a timer for 20 minutes, and the only rule is that you don't stop. You don't need to write fast. You certainly don't need to write anything of any quality, but it's just this notion, as it was explained to me anyway, that you don't sit, and this applies to other creative endeavors too, right? You don't sit at the computer and wait to have an idea and then write. What you do is you sit at the computer and write, and then maybe you have some ideas. So you're just reversing that order. And I found that tremendously helpful. I still have a big hankering for kind of structure in how I work, but as you have found as well, right, it doesn't actually lead in any reliable way to the best work. So one of the ways I get around that is I'm quite structured in the sense that I will divide up my morning writing or whatever it is into timed slots. So I will sit down and be like, okay, I'm setting a timer for 25 minutes, and in 25 minutes I'm going to try and sort of brain dump all my ideas about this section of the book or something. So it's got this kind of boundary. It satisfies the kind of anal retentive part of me that wants to have structures and boundaries. But then what's happening inside it is like, just, there are no rules, just see what happens. And I find that kind of approach quite helpful. So you do work with outcomes in mind, and you do work with goals in mind, but the goal can be something as simple as like spend 25 minutes putting almost random words on a page. And so I find that combination of structure and freedom works quite well for me.
Yeah. And are you structuring, because in stand-up comedy, one thing that's a real interesting balance is you want to come up with new material, but you can tell the comedians who are only doing new material, because you'll see them on stage every night and they'll have a different joke, but none of them are of any real good quality. You can tell that there's a premise there, but it's not really fleshed out. And sometimes I am that guy. And the other ones you'll see are people who've just been doing the same set for the last 10 years. And if you're seeing it for the first time, you go, that's brilliant. But if you've seen it for the 100th time, you're like, oh, I know your secret. And so the balance seems to be like, all right, well, I've got a premise here, and this premise looks like it could have something quality to talk about, but you got to balance that time between like editing and structuring a premise and actually elaborating or coming up with the rest of the book. Is that something that you sort of wrestle with as well in the world of writing?
Well, let me tell you what it makes me think of, and you can say if you think it's in the right ballpark. But I mean, I know what you mean, and I think I started out as a daily newspaper sort of. I was writing features, so they were more like lifestyle writing than news writing. But one of the things that is sort of drummed into you as a journalist is that you're only as good as your most recent article. That every time you get a new assignment, you're starting from scratch. Yeah, what you learn is what's drummed into you as a journalist is this notion that each new assignment you get, you start from scratch, you research it, and then you write it. And it feels like cheating to not do that, right? To sort of reuse ideas. The sort of what's happened to me very rewardingly and satisfyingly in the last sort of few years is that I do think a kind of a worldview or a sort of philosophy of life is beginning to congeal in what I write. And then I really do try to make sure that the new things I write are original and take it in new directions. But they do all sort of connect to this philosophy, right? So I don't think I'm about to start wanting to research like a history of baseball now, or a book about the plague or something, right? I am in this sort of, I've got this set of questions that I'm properly obsessed with, and that seem to have enough sort of juice in them to be able to write new and fresh things. Because actually, one of the things, stop me if I'm going on too long, but one of the things I've learned from sort of subscribers to my email newsletter and things like that is right, as you suggest in stand-up, people don't actually want necessarily complete originality every time, even if you could provide it. If you're sort of sharing a hopefully useful worldview like I am, and in some sense so's a stand-up doing, right? Maybe useful isn't the right word there, but like a compelling, funny view of the world. Actually, people value having it sort of reinforced and refreshed and going around again and coming at the same thing from different angles. So, I definitely try not to write the same paragraph that I've written before, and that wouldn't work. And even when I'm giving speeches, I really try not to be one of those people who just reads the same script every single time. I can't stand it myself, apart from but you are sort of constantly getting deeper and deeper into the same stuff. And so I think it would be a mistake to think like, oh, I've written about the necessity of making tough choices with time, so that topic's gone, right? I mean, that topic never goes away for me or for lots of people, I think.
Isn't it true? Yeah, I mean, this bookshelf behind me has got books from thousands of years ago with so many of the topics that you and I are trying to grapple with today. You seem to be grappling with it a lot more effectively than what I have. Your most recent book would suggest. But yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about the role as a journalist, coming up with new articles each and every day. Like, that's a discipline that seems as though it would correlate well into just writing your own work. Like, my examples, not from a world of journalism, but I was a competitive middle distance runner as a young guy. And I often say that it's a strange crossover, but I think for stand-up comedy, it was one of the best disciplines that I could have developed, because there really was, to a great degree, a direct correlation between, training and recovery and diet and structure, with performance. And I think just having myself just inundated or, just exposed to that from a young age made me think, okay, well, I can at least see the discipline side to some degree is really important. Like, there might be a point of diminishing return, but there's a certain level of commitment that you have to have if you want to see the results. Like, how long have you been doing your own thing for, from a writing perspective?
You broke up a little bit then, so I just asked the question one more time.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just asking, like, with sort of, I'm not sure where I cut off, but I was just saying about the discipline with running into.
No, I heard all the stuff about the running, and then you asked me a question off the back of it, and I just missed it.
Oh,
Sorry.
sure. No, I was just asking. So, like, from a journalist perspective, writing a daily article, coming into writing your own books, and as far as I'm aware, just working completely for yourself. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
there must be
basically. Yeah.
some crossover between the discipline created and your own ability to be able to, keep producing chunks of
Oh,
work.
sure. And I think it was really good training in lots of ways. And there was a sort of whole middle stretch where I was writing this weekly short column on psychology, time management, philosophy, happiness, all the rest of it. And that was like, I had to write it. I wasn't just doing whatever I wanted, and it couldn't be on anything, but I had a lot of freedom as well. So that was a great sort of middle space between go and write about this for 5 p.m. today versus book writing, where you're just sort of completely almost too free.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a really good I mean, one of the things I really learned from that is that sense of, it's Monday lunchtime and you haven't come up with a good idea for the column this week. So, okay, you're going to have to use one of the bad ideas, and you just are going to have to. And then what you're going to learn pretty soon, I bet this has some overlap with stand-up, is that you don't even know which are the good ones anyway, and the ones that you get an amazing response from versus the ones that sort of die without trace are completely uncorrelated to any question of like which one you were proudest of or which one you put the most time into. I wrote a blog post, not part of my regular column, for The Guardian years and years ago now, 2010 or something, that was in about an hour and a half, because I just had to write a blog post that morning. That was the requirement, about how everybody's just winging it all the time. It was a relation to some stuff that had happened in American politics, and I was just like, why does people expect everyone to know what they're doing? It's clear that everyone is actually just making things up as they go along, and this is true of all of us as humans. And the writing of that was an example of it, because I was also just sort of throwing that together quickly. I'm almost certain that's the most popular thing I've ever written, and I still kind of it still gets mentioned today. And so, there are magazine pieces I did for the paper where I spent like weeks and weeks and weeks carefully crafting my narrative that had no life after 24 hours after they'd appeared. So, this is really useful. It's humbling on the one hand, that idea that, nobody knows everything and nobody knows anything, as they say in Hollywood. But it should also be clear that you could only get to the good ones there, the greatest hits, as it were, by just doing a lot of stuff, right? It's got to be a sort of, in some ways, there's a sort of quantity-based approach here that just says, your job is to write a joke a day, or however it works. That's probably the wrong metric, but you know what I mean? It is not, and then just not to worry about which are the good ones, because you'll find that out.
For sure. Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, I noticed that in my own stand-up comedy, like sometimes I'll sit down for a couple of hours and come up with a joke that I'm sure will kill, and I'll get up on stage and say it. And like, apparently I'm the only one in this room that actually enjoys that joke. And then, it might have been the joke. It could have been the delivery, could have been a combination. But yeah, and like at times the throwaway line that you use to try and dig yourself out of that hole is the joke. And you're like, oh, that'll be able to be used again. Yeah, it really blows my mind.
Yeah.
Sounds like to some degree you said you had that experience with 4,000 Weeks, like it was a lot more popular than what you expected it would be. Is that like, what do you think caused that book to get such traction?
I mean, anybody's guess is as good as mine, and luck is totally a part of how all these things work. But I think that, to say something more substantive than that, I do think that the time that it was published, sort of, at least where I was at the time in America, was sort of like the properly beginning to really come out of the coronavirus pandemic, properly sort of beginning to wonder how one could integrate the lessons of that very strange time and the sort of reappraisals that people had made about how they were spending their finite time, and just the reminder everywhere that time was so finite. And I think it also, and maybe I deserve a bit more credit for this one, because I certainly didn't try to time it to the end of the coronavirus pandemic. That was pure chance, but also a real sense that old conventional optimization focused productivity advice had sort of played itself out, that it had run into the buffers. That conversation about burnout as something that kind of 25-year-olds claimed to be experiencing instead of like 50-year-olds, which is how it always used to be. The rise of the seemingly quite brief rise anyway of the sort of anti-work movement online that took this attitude that the whole, all of work is some sort of a con anyway. All these different kind of signs that it's one thing to have a whole cult industry promising people that if they follow these rules they will be able to do everything. It's another thing for that to have been going on long enough and to have reached such a fever pitch that people can see that it isn't working, and that obsessively trying to maintain inbox zero just leads to you getting more emails, and obsessively trying to manage every hour of your day in such a way as to feel relaxed never leads to relaxation, but always to more stress. So I think it was useful to sort of come in with the view that was taking shape in my mind at that point as well.
Yeah. From the I'm not sure when 4,000 Weeks was published. What, it must be three years ago then, based on the timeline you sort of just gave.
End of 2021, yeah.
End of 2021. Yeah, and that process, like, did you have meditations for mortals sort of on the horizon, or was it? I can imagine, like, when you've had the success of a book like 4,000 Weeks, you go, there's a lot of common question which are coming out of this, and I haven't seen too much of what meditations for mortals is, but I'm looking forward to getting it. I know I think you said in Australia it'll be September. I'll make sure I'll link the accurate date for everyone interested to get pre-orders in if you're interested. But what the like the motivation for the new book from that, was that like answering so many of the questions, or like how's that structured?
I mean, it came from a number of places, but one of them was definitely that the next place to go with these ideas was really to action, the question of action on a daily basis, how you actually sort of get around to doing the things that you want to spend your life and your time doing. So maybe, certainly you don't need to have read 4,000 Weeks to read this book. I've made very sure of that. But, it's possible that someone could have read 4,000 Weeks and understood on some level in a fresh way what it means to be finite, but still it's not quite the same as actually doing anything differently on a day-to-day level. And it's true for me as well, right? So I became aware, as I had lots of conversations with people in the aftermath of 4,000 Weeks being published, that although all this stuff about having limited time and needing to make tough choices with our time is like true, even once I've sort of internalized a lot of that, there's still this sense in which one kind of holds back from life, or one feels that like the real thing is going to begin a bit later when I've got everything sorted out and when I'm on top of things. So this book, the subtitle is 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. And it's organized into 4 weeks of short daily chapters. Obviously, nobody has to read a chapter per day, really, but that's the kind of invitation, I guess. And they're all very little, and they're each of them intended to sort of, in a way, kind of pull the rug from under you, right? In a way, sort of bring a perspective shift or a practical tool that is associated with like actually doing these things now. I didn't want it to be, it was really important that it wasn't a kind of a system that you would read about and then think, okay, when I get a spare moment, I'm going to put this into practice and it's all going to be great. I just wanted it to be like in the very midst of people's lives, because I think that the big problem that we have, right, or one of the big problems is telling ourselves, once all this other work's out of the way, or once I finally feel organized or qualified, or once I understand my career or how to be married or how to be a parent, or once all the sort of scary anxiety generating news headlines have calmed down, like then we'll be able to start, doing some really important stuff. And it doesn't work that way. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that anyone ever feels like they really understand what they're doing in their work or as a parent or anything else. I don't think the anxiety inducing news headlines are going to stop coming. So it's really about kind of letting go of that desire to escape from the reality in which we find ourselves, and actually using the confrontation with that reality to sort of motivate, a more meaningful and energizing life right here.
For sure.
That's my sales pitch.
Oh, for sure. No, I mean, it makes so much sense. It's a good reminder for me as well. I've heard you talk to this a little bit, but I've got two boys. I've got a boy, actually, my Charlie, he turns 4 tomorrow. And I've got Ollie, who's nearly 2. And
All right.
My house isn't, I feel like the nicest description I can offer. It's an absolute shit show. It's in the best way, but oh my gosh, it's like, I always say to my wife, I go, gee, I absolutely love it when my kids wake up. But gee, I also love it when they go to bed.
Fall asleep, yes, right.
And talking about time management, like, it's a little bit later here tonight just because of our time differences. But usually by the time they go to bed, say it's 7:30, 8 o'clock, I don't want to be a zombie tomorrow. I'm usually in bed by 10. So I go, okay, I've got 2 hours to do whatever I want. I got to talk to my wife. I got to have dinner. I'd like to do some reading, some meditation. I got to exercise. I'm like, okay, sure. Like, something has to take precedent because, like,
Right.
the amount of times, even this morning, it was doing my head in. I sat down. I've been trying to, I don't even know why I tried, because I know what's going to happen. I'm a big fan of Audible because in the car, it's like where I get peace and quiet, and I can go, okay, well, there's no kids yelling, especially when I'm driving to comedy. It's where I get my books done. But there's something about having a hard book in my hand that I still love. So I'll sit down on the couch this morning and I said to my wife, I'm going to just try and read for 15 minutes. I'm not kidding. I reckon 23 times my kids came over and they needed something. And I go, okay. And I get frustrated because there's a part of me that's like, well, I know you're the most important thing. Like, on paper, you're the most important thing in my whole life. But just for the next 15 minutes, I just want to read this stupid book if I could.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's such, I can relate to that experience so much. And it is actually relevant to something that I write about in Meditations for Mortals, not just aiming at parents at all, but like each one of these chapters has a quote at the beginning. And there's a quote here that I'll just read, if you don't mind, from C.S. Lewis, who, again, because it's him, it's framed in religious terms, but he says, like, the great thing, if one can, is to stop regarding all the unpleasant things as interruptions of one's own or real life. The truth is, of course, that what one calls the interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life God is sending one day by day. And I'm not suggesting that you consider it to be unpleasant when your children talk to you, but there is that.
I'll suggest that.
There is that. There is that problem that is very much, I argue in the book anyway, worse, exacerbated by a lot of productivity advice and approaches to getting things done, which is like, there's nothing wrong with wanting to do something other than full-on parenting as a parent. But if you set up your life to try to cram all these things in that, like, apparently you've got to do every day, or feel that you really need to get done, and you're doing it in like tiny slivers of time because actually you're at a stage in the parenting journey when you do need to be present a lot. Like, firstly, you're just making things harder for yourself, but secondly, you're defining all sorts of moments when the kid demands your attention as worse than they otherwise would be. So I always, the example I always give is if I'm working from home, and our son is 7, so a bit older. If I'm working from home and it's not my day for school pickup, so my son is somewhere in the house with my wife, and I'm working in my home office, and he bursts in to tell me excitedly about something he did at school that day. Like, I don't want to be using a system for organizing my day that makes that into a problem by saying, like, oh, I've got to be in total deep focus at this time. And, this is definitely not an argument for just letting everyone else's agendas dominate your own, even your kids' agendas. But it is an argument for, like, it's possible to see when you've got 2 children who are 4 and under that, like, in some fundamental way, like, that's where you get to be productive right now, right? Like, it's not like you have to make yourself love every minute of it. It's more like your job is like meeting challenges, all sorts of different ones, and actually for a while, a large proportion of them are going to be to do with your, being present for your kids. And I like that framing because I don't think it's not helpful to tell people that they should just love every minute of having their sort of discretionary time taken away from them, or 3/4 of it just gone the moment children
Yeah,
are on the scene. But we're not talking about, there are some people probably who I think who sort of regret having kids. Whatever. We're talking about people who do basically and in principle love the
yeah,
experience of parenting, and so I think it's really important in that not to not to feel like a failure if you don't manage to get some other agenda to dominate. Am I making that? Does that make sense?
for
I don't know.
sure. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the idea. I love that C.S. Lewis quote that you mentioned at the start. Yeah, I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis. Actually, I mean, everything that he writes, he just seems to strike gold. He's a bit of a
Right.
miracle worker in that department. I've got a
Yeah.
couple of his books on my shelf. But that's a tangent that I won't go down. But I like the idea of meeting challenges for what they are, rather than it sort of sparks a thought in my mind. I got a cousin who's been studying Buddhism for like 8 or 9 years, and he said one of the most helpful things he's learned in Buddhism is that Buddhists say that the average person gets an interruption or something difficult come to them and they're surprised by the challenge. He said, in Buddhism, we're surprised when there is no challenge. And I go, well, that makes more sense
That's
because,
great.
like, every day in every element of my life, whether it's like dropping the toothpaste or my kids screaming or whatever, I'm stuck in traffic. I mean, there's just endless opportunities for challenges. And I go, well, that really strikes a chord with me. I mean, it's one thing to say it, and I can see where he's coming from. It's another thing to live it, which always seems to be that weird threshold to cross. But I
Totally.
mean, I've got that head knowledge now, and I'm still just working on the implementation part of what he told me.
No, I think I love that way of phrasing it, and that reminds me. Sorry, my head is very deep in my new book, so I apologize for just going on about it. But I do have another section about like the idea of sort of accepting that the problem-free phase of life is never going to come. Right. This is directly related to what you just the Buddhist idea that you just mentioned. This notion that we make all our problems worse than they need to be because we not only have the problem, but we also think we shouldn't have problems in life. And I mention an anecdote that Sam Harris tells about being at lunch with a friend or coffee or something, and he's sort of moaning on about all the problems he's having to deal with in his business and his life at that moment, and she interrupts him and says something like, hold on, are you still under the illusion that one day you're going to get to the part of your life where you don't have problems? um, and he sort of realizes with a start that, like, oh yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. He knows that. He's a very clever man. But it's like, yeah, we do naturally just go adopt this stance that, like, if we work really hard, eventually it'll be like plain sailing at some point in the future, which firstly isn't true, right? Because it's just not how life works. And if anything, one has more problems as one gets older. But also, it's just you wouldn't actually want it to be true, right? I mean, it's great to avoid the worst problems. There are certain things that happen to people that I wish on nobody and I hope don't happen to me. But the very sort of existence of problems is what gives day-to-day life its interest and its meaning, right? If you actually ever manage to get to that state where you could make a plan for the day at 6 a.m. and everything would unfold exactly as you wanted it to, I think it would be hell.
Yeah. It sounds good. It sounds good, doesn't it? What's like from your perspective? Is it just like it's hell from the perspective of like it'd just be boring and like there'd be no excitement?
Well, this brings me to one of the sort of influences on my writing at the moment is this German thinker called Hartmut Rosa. I don't know if you've come across his stuff. He wrote a very,
No.
very big book called Resonance, and a very, very little book follow-up called The Uncontrollability of the World. And he makes this kind of brilliant, sustained case that everything we do in our individual lives, but also as a civilization, is on some level, or lots of it anyway, oriented towards getting more control over reality. And yet we find again and again that the thing that really gives life its sort of feeling of juice or liveliness, or what he calls resonance, is depends on us not having that control, or at least not having that complete control. So, you know, it's fun to watch. The fact that it's fun to watch a football match and the fact that you don't know who's going to win the football match are completely inextricably linked. The fact that it's fun to sort of research a new field of intellectual study depends on the fact that you don't know everything about it. And there's just again and again and again you find in life that the moments that sort of really feel the most meaningful, or where the most interesting and creative and inspiring or even lucrative things happen, right? It's not only these kind of highfalutin values, it's worldly values as well. Like, life goes better in these kind of uncontrolled spaces. So it's not to say that we should all aspire towards no control, because obviously having no control at all over life is a really psychologically harmful position to be in. But it's this very sort of subtle balance where, yeah, you have to feel like you have agency and that you have an impact on your surroundings, but you have to also not know exactly how the world is going to respond to what you do, whether people are going to laugh at a joke. And so, yeah, I think that the reason that it wouldn't work if you could just the reason it would be hell if you could just be sure that the day would go exactly as you wanted, is that it would feel kind of in this very hard to specify way that Rosa is so good at bringing into words. Like, it would feel cold and dead. Is all I can say, really, right? It would feel like you weren't engaged in it in the fullest possible way.
That's a good point. I mean, at the moment, I'm sitting here like with a mild level of frustration. I'd been training for the Melbourne Marathon, which was coming up in October, and I'd had like nearly 12 months straight of consistent training. And just on Sunday, I re-injured an old injury, and I've been racking my brain about what it was that led to it and why it's frustrating. And like, I have been really frustrated. But yeah, you're right. Like, there's a level of even that, like, that frustration has, like, I've dug a little bit deeper into the research and I'm just trying to understand it. And though, like, there is a frustrating element to it, there's a big part of that which is actually, in a big way, probably just deepening my knowledge of not only my own body, but how to train more effectively. And I mean, you said it, to steal your example, like the idea of knowing if a joke's going to hit is probably the one key thing to eliminate any of the fun from it. Part of the reason I shake before I get on stage is because I'm like, am I going to bomb? Is any of this funny? It's a really good point. Man, what's been...
I think it must be very difficult for... Sorry.
No, you go. Go.
I think it must be, on some level, quite difficult for the absolute megastars of stand-up, right? The sort of, 10 or 12 names who just, sell out multi-thousand strong stadiums wherever they go. Because, I don't know, and maybe this is not true. Maybe Jerry Seinfeld, Ricky Gervais or something would deny this, but like, does it lose something when you're absolutely certain that that the whole house is going to be in uproar at what you say? I don't know.
It's a good point. I mean, there is definitely an element, I can tell you from experience because I'm still on my way out of it, but the open mic comedy scene, so many of the people that rock up in the open mic comedy rooms aren't there to see comedy. They just happen to be there at the time that comedy breaks out around them. And part of the thrill is going, all right, like, what's going to happen? But you're right. I've actually heard Russell Brand speak to this. He was saying years ago that one of the things that he noticed was comedy got a lot easier when the crowd was there just to see him. And I mean, like, the scrutiny perhaps never ends. Even Ricky Gervais, I saw his special from like 18 months ago, and then I saw his recent special come out, and I was listening to so many people criticize, as great as it was and as silly as it was and as many boundaries as he's happy to push, and like, I find hilarious. I love that there's always someone who's very quick to point the finger at how bad this was or how it wasn't as good as his last one. So maybe the thing that keeps him motivated is that, I don't know, I'm not sure. I clearly have never been in the shoes of theirs to experience
I guess you shift your reference point perhaps from your fans who love you to the critical reception and whether the newspapers are going to say positive or negative things, maybe. But and also just on the marathon example, it just occurred to me, I don't think I'm saying that you have to find a way to be grateful that you've experienced an injury, right? I think the frustration of that can be totally dominant. But to go the very far opposite direction. Like, imagine that we were not the creatures that we are, and that just by deciding on your time that you were going to complete that marathon in, you just knew for a fact through all the training and then the marathon that it was going to come out at that exact time that you'd chosen. Like,
Yeah.
there'd be no point in doing it. Like, that would be the weirdest thing to want to do, to just sort of, to just, for your life to just be fulfilling the steps of a plan. And yet, read a bunch of conventional productivity advice, and the implication will be that paradise is that you make a bunch of steps first thing in the morning and then spend the rest of the day with no variation or interruption.
It's so true. Or like, to extend that out a little bit, is just like commit to the career of your choice for 40 years, and then retirement will be the time that you enjoy yourself, should you happen to make it there.
Right. No, exactly.
Just before I let you go, Oliver, I've got my eye on the clock. Is there any particular theme that sort of stood out to you, or one particular, I'm not sure if topic's the right way to phrase it, but from the new book, what's been your big takeaways? Is there something that's really stood out amongst the rest in the preparation and the writing?
I mean, I think the guide of the fascinating thing for me, maybe not for other people, I don't know, about writing in this kind of field, is that I'm constantly like having to experience the message that I'm writing about in order to get the book written. So if I'm writing about the importance of embracing imperfection and I get stuck, it's like, oh yeah, I need to embrace imperfection to finish this chapter, right? So I'm always kind of having to learn my own lessons. And I think one of the sort of perspectives that has helped me the most there is the one that I refer to in the book as with the phrase, it's worse than you think, right? So that actually over and over again, I find that the path to more peace of mind, but also to more productivity and more creativity, is seeing the sense in which your problems are actually worse than you thought they were. And I like this because it's funny, and people are like, well, how can that possibly be good news? But I think it's fairly easy to show how it is, right? So if you think, for example, that your problem is, if you're really busy, that you've got far too many emails to deal with and bills to pay and things to keep track of, and that it's really, really difficult to try to get on top of all of them. But I would want to say, no, it's worse than you think, because you're finite and that's an infinite supply. It's not really difficult. It's actually impossible. And that is an immediate cause of relief, I think. There's another example in the creative context that I give in that, but well, just you might feel, if you're a perfectionist, you probably think that it's incredibly difficult to produce perfect work. But when you see that it's actually completely impossible to produce perfect work, that perfect work can't exist in reality, only in sort of vague fantasies of your mind, that's wonderful. That's a liberating thing. That means then, okay, so then you can just do the work without all this worry. You can do what, there's a writer I quote in the book, Sasha Chapin, who calls it the state of playing in the ruins. It's like, okay, it's over. This idea that I was going to be a perfect novelist or a perfect writer or a perfect stand-up, that ship has sailed. Great. Now I can just do the stuff and enjoy it, and almost certainly give birth to the greatest work that I'm capable of in that situation. And just to finish this thought, I quote a great British-born Zen master called Jiu Kennett, and she used to say that her preferred way of teaching students in Zen was not to lighten the burden of the student, but to make it so heavy that he or she would put it down. And what I take that to mean, I mean, maybe it's already obvious, but is that you can constantly purport to be helping people by saying, like, here's how you get on top of everything, here's how you solve the problem of human existence, here's how you make it not emotionally vulnerable to be in a relationship, here's how you make it so that you don't have problems in life, and like constantly promising to make their burden lighter. Or you can do the opposite and say, like, this situation is beyond hope in a very important sense. The burden is so heavy, so just put it down Stop trying to get to the point where relationships don't make you feel vulnerable, where work doesn't feel like there's too much of it, where you always feel like you could have done slightly better in a piece of work that you produce. Don't worry about trying to solve the problem of being human. And then you can actually live human life, right? I think that's a really, really important message that I've tried to get across in this book.
Awesome, man. No, I'm really looking forward to seeing it. Once again, man, I know you're flat out. You got a lot on the plate. I was, as I said to you at the start, I was so pumped when you agreed to come on. So, mate, I really appreciate it. For everyone listening, I'll make sure that I've linked 4,000 Weeks and a link to the new book, Meditation for Mortals, in the description to this episode. But dude, thanks again, man. Really grateful.
I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm fairly confident that I've made you stay up to some absurd hour in order to have this conversation. So I'm really appreciative of that as well, because it's just the early afternoon where I am.
Oh man, no, it's I feel like it's something I'm well aware of when I organise a conversation with anyone in the UK. It's going to be either a really late night or a really early morning. And to be honest, I think I prefer the late nights.
Okay,
so no worries at all.
I'm grateful that you did it, and I hope that you're not totally woken by two small children after about 3 hours sleep.
All right, man. We'll leave it there. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Tyson.